The endless darkness of space stretched out like a black canvas, dotted with distant starlight. The Calran diplomatic vessel, Horizon's Promise, moved silently through the Nexus cluster, its sleek silver hull reflecting pinpricks of starlight. Commander Haven sat in his command chair, his four-fingered hands resting lightly on the control panel. "Anomalous signal detected," announced Juwu, the ship's senior communications officer. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of tension in her tone. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a small, irregular energy signature drifting among the stellar debris. Heiyun leaned forward. Space was rarely this quiet. Anomalies meant trouble, and trouble meant paperwork. Lots of it. "Magnify," he commanded. The hologram zoomed in. What appeared to be a damaged escape pod tumbled slowly, its outer shell scorched and dented. Small jets of frozen vapor escaped from multiple fractures, creating a delicate crystal-like trail behind the damaged craft. "Life signs?" Heiyun asked. Juwu's fingers danced across her console. Faint, very faint, but definitely present. The bridge fell silent. The Calran were not a species known for abandoning potential survivors, even if those survivors were from unknown origins. Their diplomatic protocols were clear. All sentient life deserved a chance. "Retrieve the pod," Heiyun ordered. The ship's mechanical arms extended, moving with surprising gentleness. They wrapped around the damaged escape pod, pulling it into the vessel's secure cargo bay. Heiyun and Juwu exchanged a look. Something about this felt different. In the cargo bay, medical technicians in protective suits carefully cut through the pod's damaged exterior. The metal peeled away like the skin of a strange fruit, revealing its contents. And there, curled up in a space barely larger than a small closet, was a child. He was small, no more than 5 years old. His skin was pale, his dark hair matted with frost, and what looked like dried blood. Despite the harsh conditions he had survived, the child was alive. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. The medical team worked quickly. They scanned him, checked his vital signs, and began warming his body. The child didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't even open his eyes. Heiyun arrived in the cargo bay, his tall frame casting a shadow over the medical team. He looked down at the child, feeling something he couldn't quite explain. Curiosity, concern, something that went beyond standard diplomatic procedure. "Who are you?" he whispered, though the child couldn't hear him. A medical technician approached. Male, human, approximately 5 Earth years old. Multiple signs of trauma. Miraculously alive, but something is unusual about his physiological readings. Juwu entered the bay, her datapad already filling with information. Humans are rare this far from their home systems. How did he get here? The escape pod offered no answers. Its navigation systems were fried, its communication arrays destroyed. Whatever story this child carried was locked away in his small, unconscious form. Heiyun made a decision. Prepare medical quarters. He'll be our guest until we understand more. As they moved the child to a specially prepared medical bay, nobody noticed the slight twitch of his fingers. Nobody saw the briefest flicker of awareness in his closed eyes. The child who would change everything was about to wake up. And the universe would never be the same. 3 standard solar cycles after the rescue, the human child named David had become the most talked about mystery on the Horizon's Promise. He had woken up on the 2nd day after his rescue, his eyes bright and alert, showing none of the expected trauma one might see in a child who had survived such an ordeal. Juwu watched David from the observation deck. The child sat in a learning center, surrounded by complex interactive screens that would challenge most adult Calran scientists. His small fingers moved quickly, connecting dots and solving problems that seemed impossible for a 5-year-old. "What are you doing?" she asked, approaching him. David looked up. His eyes were different, not just in color, but in how they seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm fixing the communication protocol," he said simply. Juwu froze. The ship's communication system was a complex network developed by the most skilled Calran engineers. Fixing, she repeated. The child pointed to the screen. There's a loop here that makes messages slow. If you change this connection point, it can move 22% faster. He spoke as if he was talking about something as simple as tying shoelaces. The ship's chief engineer, Raken, reviewed David's suggested modifications later that day. His tentacle-like appendages moved nervously over the data. This is impossible, he muttered. But the math was perfect. David's suggestion would indeed improve communication efficiency. In the dining hall, David created more confusion. Calran food was complex, nutrient cubes that required specific preparation and consumption methods. Most alien species found the process challenging. David watched the crew for exactly 3 meals before he began eating perfectly, using utensils with a precision that seemed to defy his age. Commander Hyun noticed something else. David asked questions, not the simple questions of a child, but precise, probing inquiries that suggested deep understanding. Why do your ships use this specific energy configuration? David asked during a tour of the engine room. The lead engineer stammered. Most 5-year-olds would be fascinated by blinking lights. This child was analyzing complex energy distribution systems. Meals became interesting events. David would sit quietly, observing the crew. He learned their language with impossible speed. Within weeks, he spoke Calran better than most diplomatic translators, capturing not just words, but subtle cultural nuances. The child is not normal, Raken told Juwoo one evening. He's something else entirely. The medical team was equally puzzled. David's medical scans showed something strange. His brain activity was different, more connected, more fluid. Areas that should be developing were already showing signs of advanced cognitive processing. One evening, David approached Commander Hyun. I want to help, he said simply. The ship can be better. Hyun looked down at the small human. For a moment, he saw not a child, but something else. Something that made the vast, cold universe feel suddenly very small. Help? Hyun asked. David nodded. There are things I know. Things that can make everything work better. The crew watched. They whispered. They wondered. Who was this child? What was he? And more importantly, what would he become? Outside the ship's windows, stars continued their silent dance. The universe held its breath, waiting. The engineering deck hummed with quiet tension. David sat in a corner, his small legs dangling from a high stool, watching the team work. His eyes moved quickly, tracking every movement, every connection, every subtle shift in the complex machinery that powered the Horizon's promise. Raken, the lead engineer, was checking the ship's energy distribution system. It was a routine maintenance check, something they'd done 1,000 times before. Suddenly, David spoke. That junction isn't right, he said quietly. Everyone stopped. The entire engineering team turned to look at the small human child. Juwoo, who had been observing, leaned forward. What do you mean, David? The boy pointed to a specific energy conduit. If you adjust the secondary relay here and redistribute the power flow by 12.3 degrees, you'll save 37% of current energy consumption. Silence filled the room. Raken's tentacle-like appendages moved nervously. Engineers exchanged looks. This was not something a 5-year-old should understand, not something even most trained engineers could calculate so quickly. Show me, Raken demanded. David slid off the stool and walked to the main console. His small fingers moved across the complex interface with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. Lines of code shifted. Diagrams rearranged themselves. Complex mathematical equations danced across the screen. Within minutes, David had mapped out an entirely new energy distribution system. The calculations were perfect. More than perfect. They were revolutionary. How did you know? Juwoo asked later, after the engineering team had verified David's modifications. David shrugged. I just saw how it could work better. Word spread quickly through the ship. The human child who had been a mysterious passenger was becoming something more. The crew watched him differently now. No longer just a survivor. No longer just a curiosity. During mealtimes, David would sit quietly, observing. He learned everything. How the ship worked, how the crew interacted, the subtle nuances of Kalran culture. His language skills improved daily. He understood not just words, but context, humor, subtext. Commander Heiyun called a private meeting with Juwu and Reiken. "This is not normal," he said, looking at David's recent reports. "A child should not be able to do this." Reiken nodded. "His brain scans are unlike anything we've seen. The neural connections, they're different, more complex, more connected." Juwu had been studying David carefully. "He's adapting," she said, "not just learning, adapting." They watched David through the observation window. He was solving a complex spatial puzzle. His small tongue stuck out in concentration. To anyone else, he would look like a normal child. But they knew better. Something was different about this human child. Something extraordinary was happening. And they were just beginning to understand what that might mean. Outside the ship's windows, stars continued their silent journey. Space remained vast and mysterious. But something had changed. The universe felt smaller somehow, more knowable. David looked up, catching their eye. He smiled, a simple, childlike smile that held something more, something that suggested he knew far more than he was saying. The first signs were clear. This was no ordinary child. And their journey was just beginning. The training simulation room was silent. David sat in a special chair, his small feet not quite touching the floor. Around him, holographic displays flickered with complex battle scenarios. Military strategists from the Kalran fleet watched carefully. Commander Heiyun leaned forward. This was not a typical training exercise. The simulation began. It was a standard defensive scenario, a small fleet protecting a critical space station from multiple attack vectors. The Kalran tactical AI began its standard response, moving ships in predictable defensive patterns. David's fingers moved across the control interface. Suddenly, everything changed. The holographic ships stopped moving in their usual careful formations. Instead, they began to move in a way no one had ever seen before. It was like watching a complex dance, each ship becoming part of a living, breathing strategy that defied all standard tactical thinking. The tactical AI had been programmed with hundreds of years of Kalran military history. It knew every standard defensive maneuver, every possible attack pattern. But David was different. He wasn't following rules. He was breaking them. The attacking fleet, which should have overwhelmed the defenders in previous simulations, found itself completely outmaneuvered. Ships that would typically be destroyed were now turning the battle around. The space station, always lost in previous attempts, remained completely safe. When the simulation ended, complete silence filled the room. Juwu checked the results. "This is impossible," she whispered. The simulation showed a 98.7% success rate. In previous runs, the success rate had never gone above 32%. David had not just improved the strategy. He had completely reimagined it. "How did you do that?" asked Reiken, the lead engineer who had been watching closely. David looked up. "I just watched how they moved. And then I thought about what they would least expect." The military strategists exchanged looks. This was not just a lucky guess. This was something more. A level of strategic thinking that seemed to come from somewhere beyond standard training or programming. "The boy understands spatial dynamics in a way I've never seen," one strategist muttered. "It's like he can see the entire battle from every possible angle at once." Commander Heiyun studied David carefully. The child showed no excitement, no pride. He simply looked at the screen as if he had done something as ordinary as tying his shoes. More simulations followed. Different scenarios, different challenges. Each time, David found solutions that seemed to come from somewhere beyond logic. He didn't just solve problems, he reimagined them completely. A senior military advisor pulled Hae-yun aside. "Do you understand what we're seeing?" he asked. "This is not just intelligence. This is something else entirely." David continued to work, unaware of the conversations happening around him. To him, this was simple, normal, just another day. But to the Calran crew, everything was changing. The universe felt different now. Smaller, more noble, and far more complex than they had ever imagined. Outside the simulation room, stars continued their silent journey. But something had changed. Something fundamental. A small human child had just shown them a glimpse of a future they could never have imagined. And they were just beginning to understand what that might mean. The training simulation room was silent. David sat in a special chair, his small feet not quite touching the floor. Around him, holographic displays flickered with complex battle scenarios. Military strategists from the Calran fleet watched carefully. Commander Hae-yun leaned forward. This was not a typical training exercise. The simulation began. It was a standard defensive scenario, a small fleet protecting a critical space station from multiple attack vectors. The Calran tactical AI began its standard response, moving ships in predictable defensive patterns. David's fingers moved across the control interface. Suddenly, everything changed. The holographic ships stopped moving in their usual careful formations. Instead, they began to move in a way no one had ever seen before. It was like watching a complex dance, each ship becoming part of a living, breathing strategy that defied all standard tactical thinking. The tactical AI had been programmed with hundreds of years of Calran military history. It knew every standard defensive maneuver, every possible attack pattern. But David was different. He wasn't following rules. He was breaking them. The attacking fleet, which should have overwhelmed the defenders in previous simulations, found itself completely outmaneuvered. Ships that would typically be destroyed were now turning the battle around. The space station, always lost in previous attempts, remained completely safe. When the simulation ended, complete silence filled the room. Jiwoo checked the results. "This is impossible," she whispered. The simulation showed a 98.7% success rate. In previous runs, the success rate had never gone above 32%. David had not just improved the strategy. He had completely reimagined it. "How did you do that?" asked Royken, the lead engineer who had been watching closely. David looked up. "I just watched how they moved. And then I thought about what they would least expect." The military strategists exchanged looks. This was not just a lucky guess. This was something more. A level of strategic thinking that seemed to come from somewhere beyond standard training or programming. "The boy understands spatial dynamics in a way I've never seen," one strategist muttered. "It's like he can see the entire battle from every possible angle at once." Commander Haven studied David carefully. The child showed no excitement, no pride. He simply looked at the screen as if he had done something as ordinary as tying his shoes. More simulations followed. Different scenarios, different challenges. Each time, David found solutions that seemed to come from somewhere beyond logic. He didn't just solve problems, he reimagined them completely. A senior military advisor pulled Hae-yun aside. "Do you understand what we're seeing?" he asked. "This is not just intelligence. This is something else entirely." David continued to work, unaware of the conversations happening around him. To him, this was simple, normal, just another day. But to the Calran crew, everything was changing. The universe felt different now. Smaller, more noble, and far more complex than they had ever imagined. Outside the simulation room, stars continued their silent journey. But something had changed. Something fundamental. A small human child had just shown them a glimpse of a future they could never have imagined. And they were just beginning to understand what that might mean. Alarms screamed through the horizon's promise. Red warning lights flashed everywhere. The ship shook with the impact of the first attack. David sat in the corner of the bridge, calm and still. Commander Hae-yun watched him for just a moment before turning back to the battle. The attacking ships were from the Vork Confederation, a species known for their aggressive expansion and complex battle tactics. They had heard about the human child. They wanted him. "Incoming missile barrage," shouted Juwu from the communication station. Her fingers flew across the control panels, trying to calculate defensive maneuvers. But David was faster. "Move the secondary shield generator 2 degrees to the left," he said quietly. "Redirect power from the backup systems." Heiyun didn't question. He had learned to trust the child's instincts. The ship's systems shifted exactly as David suggested. The missiles that should have destroyed them suddenly went off course. They missed the horizon's promise by mere meters. The Vork ships were good. They were the best tactical force in this part of the galaxy. Their ships moved like living things, adapting to every standard defensive pattern. But David was not standard. "They will attack the port side in exactly 42 seconds, David said. No emotion, just a statement of fact. 42 seconds later, the Vork ships attacked exactly where David had predicted. But the Horizon's promise was ready. Its defensive systems were already in position. Rekan, the lead engineer, looked at David with a mix of fear and wonder. "How do you know these things?" he asked. David just shrugged. "I can see the patterns," he said simply. The battle continued. What should have been a quick defeat turned into a complex dance of strategy. The Horizon's promise moved in ways no Kalran ship had ever moved before. Each maneuver was perfect. Each defensive action was exactly right. "They want the child," Haven muttered to Juwu, "but they don't understand what they're dealing with." David heard. Of course he heard. He heard everything. "I don't want to be a weapon," he said quietly. "I want to help." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled the entire bridge. More Vork ships appeared. This should have been the moment of final defeat, the moment when the Horizon's promise would be destroyed. But David was watching, calculating, understanding. His small hand moved across a control panel. Ships that should have destroyed them suddenly found themselves fighting each other. The Vork fleet's own communication systems turned against them. In less than 10 minutes, the entire attack was over. Silence filled the bridge. Haven looked at David. The child looked back. No celebration, no excitement, just a simple understanding that something important had happened. "We're safe," David said. Outside the ship's windows, broken Vork ships drifted in space, a testament to something nobody could fully understand. The universe had just changed, and at the center of that change was a small human child who saw the world differently from anyone else. Space went silent. Then, suddenly, it was full of light. Human warships appeared as if they had been waiting. Not just a few ships, not just a squadron. An entire fleet materialized around the Horizon's promise, their designs sleek and unlike anything the Kalran had ever seen. Commander Heiyun stared in complete shock. David sat quietly, watching. No surprise in his eyes, no excitement, just a calm understanding that suggested he knew exactly what was happening. The lead human ship sent a communication. Its message was clear and direct. "We are here for the child," the transmission said, but there was something different about the way they said it. Not a threat, not an attack, something more like a retrieval. Juwu looked at the incoming data. "These ships," she whispered, "they're not like any military vessels we've seen before." Each human ship moved with a precision that seemed almost alive. They didn't just navigate space. They seemed to understand it, to breathe with it. Their positioning was so perfect it looked like a complex dance. "How did they find us?" Raken asked. David looked up. "They were always watching," he said simply. The Kalran crew realized something important. This was no random rescue, no accidental encounter. Everything that had happened, from the moment they found David's escape pod, had been planned. Human communication channels opened. No weapons charged, no aggressive moves, just a calm, calculated presence. "We appreciate the care you've shown," the human communication said. David is part of a special program. Heun stepped forward. What program? He asked. The response was fascinating. The humans explained, briefly and precisely, that David was part of an experimental diplomatic initiative, a living bridge between civilizations, not a weapon, not a tool, something more complex. David listened. The crew watched him. He showed no emotion about potentially leaving. No fear, no excitement. I will help, David said to the Kauran. What I learned here will help everyone. The human fleet's arrival changed everything. Other alien civilizations watching the sector suddenly became very quiet. The precision of the human response was a clear message. This was not a species to be taken lightly. Diplomatic channels that had been closed for generations suddenly opened. The humans were not aggressive. They were calculating. Strategic. They had placed a child, this child, as a living communication device. He understands systems, one human communication explained. Not just technical systems, social systems, communication systems, living systems. The Kauran crew looked at David differently now. He was no longer just a mysterious child they had rescued. He was something more, a living piece of a much larger puzzle. Space around them felt different, smaller, more connected. David looked out the window. His eyes reflected starlight. Behind those eyes was an understanding of the universe that no one, not the Kauran, not the humans, not any civilization, fully comprehended. The rescue was complete, but something much bigger was just beginning. And at the center of it all was a small human child who saw the world in a way no one else could. The human research facility was unlike anything the Kauran crew had ever seen. Clean, bright, walls that seemed to change color with thinking. David moved through the space like he was coming home. Commander Heun and Juwu watched carefully. They had been invited to learn the truth about the child they had rescued months ago. A human scientist named Dr. Elena approached. Her movements were calm. Her eyes were kind but sharp. David is special, she said, but not in the way you think. The room had screens everywhere. Images of David's past flickered like memories. Medical scans, training sessions, moments that showed something more than a normal child's life. He is not a real child, Dr. Elena explained. Not in the way you understand childhood. David sat quietly. He listened. He watched. No emotion showed on his face. The screens told a story. David was part of a special human program, a living communication system designed to bridge gaps between different civilizations. His apparent childhood was a carefully created interface, a way to learn, to understand, to connect. We needed someone who could see patterns, Dr. Elena said, not just in technology, in communication, in social systems, in the way different species think. Heun asked the question everyone wanted to know. Why a child? Dr. Elena smiled. Children learn without barriers, without the complicated rules adults create. David can understand things adults cannot because he is not limited by traditional thinking. The Kauran crew watched more screens. They saw David in different training scenarios, learning languages faster than computers, understanding complex social dynamics in ways no one could explain. He is not a weapon, Dr. Elena said firmly. He is a bridge. David looked up. I want to help civilizations understand each other, he said simply. The screen showed more. Moments of David solving problems that seemed impossible, connecting ideas that no one else could see, understanding communication in ways that went beyond words. His brain is different, Dr. Elena explained, designed to process information in multiple dimensions, to see connections that others miss. Juwu looked closely at David. The child, no, the living communication system, looked back. His eyes held something more than a child's understanding. The human facility was full of advanced technology, but David was the most advanced thing in the room. We found a way to create someone who could truly understand, Dr. Elena continued. Not just translate, not just communicate, but truly understand. More images played. David learning, adapting, understanding complex systems in moments that would take others years. He is a prototype, Dr. Elena said, the first of many. The Cowran crew understood something important. This was not just about one child. This was about a new way of understanding the universe. David stood up. I learned much from the Cowran, he said. I will use that learning to help other civilizations. Outside the facility, stars continued their silent journey. But something had changed. A new kind of communication had been born. And at the center of it all was a system designed to look like a child. A bridge between worlds. 1 year after David's true purpose was revealed, the galaxy looked different. Diplomatic meetings that used to take months now happened in days. Conflicts that seemed impossible to solve found surprising resolutions. And at the center of it all was David, no longer just a child, but a living communication bridge between civilizations. The Cowran government hall was full of alien representatives. Species that had never spoken to each other now sat together. David moved between groups, speaking languages that seemed to change with each breath. Commander Heiyun watched from the side. He remembered the day they found David in that damaged escape pod. So much had changed. He is not just translating, Ju said, standing beside Heiyun. He is helping them truly understand each other. Different alien species looked at David with something between wonder and respect. He wasn't a weapon. He wasn't a tool. He was something more. A living system that could see connections nobody else could see. A Vorok representative, from the same civilization that had attacked them a year ago, now spoke peacefully with a Cowran diplomat. David had been part of making that happen. The screens around the hall showed diplomatic agreements being signed. Trade routes opened. Cultural exchanges planned. Things that would have been impossible just a year before. How do you do this? A young diplomat asked David. David smiled. I just help people see what they have in common, he said simply. His abilities went beyond language. He understood social systems, economic systems, the complex ways different species thought and felt. He could see the invisible threads that connected different civilizations. The human scientists who created David watched carefully. This was more than an experiment. This was a new way of understanding the universe. Outside the diplomatic hall, human warships remained in strategic positions, not as a threat, but as a reminder. A gentle promise that this new way of communication was protected. We are not conquering, Dr. Elena had explained earlier. We are connecting. David moved between groups. Sometimes he looked like a child, sometimes like something else entirely, a living bridge between worlds. The Cowran crew who had first rescued him washed with pride. They had found something extraordinary, something that would change everything. More diplomatic meetings were planned, more cultural exchanges arranged. David would be at the center of each one, helping different species understand each other in ways they never could before. Heiyun remembered the small, damaged escape pod, the child they had rescued. The universe had seemed so large then, so complicated. Now it felt smaller, more connected. David looked up and caught Heiyun's eye. He smiled, a smile that held entire universes of understanding. The galaxy was changing, and at the center of that change was a system designed to look like a child. A bridge between worlds. A new way of understanding. The stars outside continued their silent dance, but something fundamental had shifted. Humanity had found a way to connect, to understand, to bring different worlds together. And it all started with a rescue, with a child, with a promise of something more.